I'm Joan Youngman. I'm a senior fellow here at the Lincoln Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture on property tax abatements, land value tax in disguise, by Professor John Anderson of the University of Nebraska, who's a visiting fellow here at the Lincoln Institute. John is an economist, and the wide range of his interests covers public finance, taxation, property taxation, economic development, urban economics, and a deep interest in the issues facing economies in transition. He's an engaged scholar. He's someone who is very willing to put his academic expertise to the use of improving public policy. He's advised many legislatures and state agencies. He's served as assistant treasurer of the state of Michigan. He has served as a senior economist with the Council of Economic Advisors in Washington, and he has worked with transition economies, almost too many to name, but a few of them just in alphabetical order include Bulgaria, China, Macedonia, Moldova, Mongolia, Russia, Tajikistan, and he and his family lived in Moldova for a year while he was helping with economic issues there. He's been associate dean and interim dean at the College of Business Affairs at Nebraska, where he won the Distinguished Faculty Award in 2007. And his voluminous writings include a new edition of his public finance textbook just out this year, and literally tens and tens of journal articles on everything from the effect of the U.S. mortgage interest deduction in the federal income tax to an article in Russian on privatization of state property. That was written in honor of the 200th anniversary of the economics department at Moscow State University. And John wrote it in English, but it was the chair of the department who was his translator. So his work with Lincoln has touched on so many of our critical issues. Last June, he was talking about land leasing and value capture at our annual land policy conference. He and Richard England, a visiting fellow, are working on issues concerning use value assessment of agricultural property for property tax purposes. He contributed the overall review chapter looking at all the evidence on land value taxation in the 2009 volume that was edited by Dick Dye, our visiting fellow who's here, and Richard England. And next month, when you get your newsletter, Landlines, you'll see that he has an 8-page article on access to land and building permits, which include excellent photographs of Mongolia, Turkey, and Moldova taken by John Anderson. But I think one of the things we're proudest of here at Lincoln is that John received Lincoln Fellowship support when he was doing his graduate work and his dissertation in economics. So this was long before we had formalized the C. Lowell Harris program for dissertation fellowship support. And we can only hope that the young scholars who are receiving these fellowships now will turn out to be as productive and as public-spirited as John is. So please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Joan, for that kind introduction. I am very grateful to the Lincoln Institute, as Joan said. From my graduate school days onward, they've been very supportive of my interests in economics. When Dick Dye and I were talking about some land value tax issues, we began to focus on this notion that property tax abatements, which I've studied for a number of years, might be an indirect form of land value tax. Our work on the land value tax led us to think a little bit harder about that. And what I'm presenting today is a joint paper with Dick. So I want to acknowledge this is a joint work with Dick Dye, who's at the University of Illinois and a fellow here at the Lincoln Institute. We got support from Lincoln to do this work, and it's a preliminary study which we hope to flesh out in fuller detail with a group of scholars that we're asking to come in late January and talk about this a bit more fully and see whether there's merit to pursuing this idea in more depth academically and also in terms of policy implementation. So we view ourselves at the beginning of this process in thinking through whether tax abatements can be used as an indirect way of accomplishing a notable objective, which is to move toward land value taxation, at least in some contexts. So, by way of introduction, there are many advantages of a land value tax that have been well known for a long time, going back at least to Henry George, if not earlier. He believed in competitive markets and private property for encouraging efficiency in production, but he recognized that the return to land, which is a fixed factor, was a return that was in some sense unearned or unjustified, and it was distinct from the return to capital improvements that might have been applied to the land by the landowner. And so he proposed retaining private ownership, but taxing away the value of the land, which reflected more fully either location characteristics or natural resources or the value of the public goods and services and amenities that might be there. And he thought ultimately that if you taxed land only, you would get landowners putting their land into its highest and best use, as we like to call it. So there are very strong both efficiency and equity arguments in favor of taxing land, but not taxing the structures and improvements that are applied to land. And of course, this is a strong theme that runs throughout much of the work here at the Lincoln Institute that we acknowledge. So under a land value tax, the value of the land is taxed, but not the value of the capital improvements that are applied to the land. And as I said, both efficiency and equity gains come from that when compared to a traditional property tax where you apply generally one tax rate to the combined value of the land, the site, and all improvements that are on that land. So the essential issue we wanted to look at in this work is whether it's possible to mimic the effects of a land value tax for business property. That's how we're starting to think about this, by using a traditional property tax with abatements for capital improvements. My thinking on this goes back to work I've done related to communities in the Detroit metro area. Prior to moving out to Nebraska, I spent a lot of years in Michigan and did research related to the municipalities in the metro Detroit area. My colleague Rob Wassmer and I did a lot of research and published a book in 2000 on Detroit communities and the way they were using economic development incentives of all kinds, including abatements. And we found that among the 112 municipalities in metro Detroit, for example, the average community was abating away about 35% of its industrial tax base. And so property tax abatements can be a very substantial way by which communities are providing economic development incentives, and they can represent a very large share of the potential tax base as well. So thinking along those lines, it's not inconceivable that you could expand abatements in a direction that is consistent with land value taxation instead of being arbitrary with regard to granting particular abatements to particular firms and specific projects, but doing it in a more comprehensive, systematic way. So what we do in this paper, Dick Dye and I, is provide an overview of what the ideal abatement program would look like from the point of view if your policy objective were to mimic the way a land value tax works. And then we, once we've set up the ideal, then we look at how states actually do it with their abatement programs that they permit under state statutes. And we compare the two, and then we comment on how the ideal is different from the actual practice. And then we make some policy suggestions for how you might reconfigure the existing abatement programs in order to be more consistent with what an ideal abatement plan would look like if your objective were to mimic a land value tax.